It is February 1st, 1943, and 26,000 feet above Nazi Germany. Something is about to happen that will be locked away in a classified vault for the next 55 years. A photograph. Just one photograph. Stamped top secret in red ink, so bold it looks like a warning. And when that photo finally gets declassified in 1998, aviation engineers will stare at it in silence, shake their heads, and say the same thing over and over again. That should not be possible, because what the camera captured that day was not a crash. It was not wreckage falling from the sky. It was two aircraft, locked together in midair. Metal fused to metal. One plane's fuselage torn open like a tin can, the other jammed into it like a knife through paper, and both of them still flying. Not gliding. Not tumbling. Flying. For 90 minutes. Over enemy territory. With 10 men inside who were not supposed to survive the next 10 seconds, let alone the next hour and a half. So here's the question nobody at the Air Force wanted to answer when this incident was finally made public. If the physics said they should have died, if the engineers said the aircraft could not hold together, if every simulation and every calculation and every precedent in aviation history pointed to immediate structural failure and catastrophic breakup, then how did they land? And more importantly, why did the United States military bury this story for half a century? What were they hiding? Let me take you back to that moment. The collision itself happens in a fraction of a second. A P-47 fighter escort, trying to close formation in thick cloud cover, misjudges his distance by less than 20 feet. 20 feet. In the sky, at 250 miles per hour, 20 feet is nothing. It is a blink, a breath. And then the fighter's propeller chews into the tail section of a B-17 bomber designated All-American 3. Metal screams. Rivets explode like gunfire. The fuselage splits open from the waist gunner station all the way back to the tail, a 16-foot gash that cuts through skin, through stringers, through structural members that are supposed to hold the entire back end of the aircraft together. The tail gunner, sitting in his plexiglass bubble at the very rear, watches his entire world tilt and separate. He can see sky where there should be metal. He can see the ground 26,000 feet below him through a hole that should not exist. And he is still strapped into a seat that is still attached to an airplane that is somehow impossibly still in the air. Inside the cockpit, Second Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg feels the impact like a punch to the spine. The control yoke shudders. The instrument panel flickers. And for one terrible moment, he waits for the break. Because in every training manual, in every accident report, in every briefing he has ever sat through, this is where the aircraft comes apart. This is where the tail section separates, the nose pitches down, and everyone inside begins the long fall to earth with no parachute, no time, no chance. But the break does not come. The tail stays attached. Barely. Held together by two main structural spars and a few control cables that should have snapped on impact, but somehow did not. The B-17 is still flying, except it is not flying like a B-17 anymore. It is flying like a broken thing that has forgotten it is supposed to fall. The airspeed drops. The nose wants to yaw left. The whole aircraft shudders with a vibration that feels like the sky is trying to shake it apart. And Bragg realizes, in a cold wave of clarity, that he is now piloting something that does not exist in any manual, any training program, any emergency procedure he has ever been taught. He is flying an aircraft that is half destroyed and still airborne over Nazi Germany, with 90 miles of hostile territory between him and safety, and he has no idea if the next gentle turn, the next small adjustment, the next pocket of turbulence will be the thing that finally tears the tail off and sends all 10 men aboard into an uncontrolled spin toward the ground. So what does he do? What would you do? You are in the left seat. You have just felt your aircraft get hit by another aircraft, and you are still alive, still flying, but you do not know for how long. Do you try to make it home? Order the crew to bail out right now while you still have altitude? Do you try to turn, knowing that a turn might rip the weakened structure apart? Or do you just hold it steady, keep it level, and hope that whatever is holding the tail on keeps holding for another hour? Because here is what makes this story so disturbing. Bragg does not have time to think it through. None of them do. The decision has to be made in seconds, with incomplete information, with adrenaline screaming through every nerve, with the knowledge that one wrong choice kills everyone. And whatever choice he makes in that moment will either become the reason they survive or the reason they do not. But before we go any further, let me tell you why you are watching this. This is World War II Uncovered, and we tell the stories that were classified, buried, or forgotten. The ones where the official record does not match what actually happened, where the physics says it is impossible, but the evidence says it is real. If that is the kind of history you want, go ahead and subscribe right now, hit that bell, because we are about to take you through the full 90 minutes of this flight, step by step, decision by decision, and by the end, you are going to understand not just how they survived, but why the Air Force kept it secret for 55 years. Now, back to the sky. Because Bragg makes his decision. He does not bail out. He does not turn back. He does something that sounds insane when you hear it, but makes perfect sense when you understand what he is seeing. He keeps flying straight. He holds the aircraft in a narrow band of speed and altitude where it feels stable, where the vibration is bad but not catastrophic, where the tail stays attached even though it should not. And he starts doing math in his head. Not complex aerodynamics. Not engineering calculations. Just simple, brutal arithmetic. How far to friendly airspace? How much fuel? How long can this structure hold together before it fails? And the answer he arrives at is this. Maybe long enough. Maybe? So he tells his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel, to start moving crew members forward. Shift weight away from the damaged tail. Dump the ammunition from the waist guns. Anything that reduces stress on those two remaining structural spars. And then he does something even stranger. He tells the radio operator to stay silent. No distress call. No emergency declaration. Nothing. Because the moment ground control hears what has happened, they are going to order him to bail out. They are going to tell him that the aircraft is unflyable, that he is risking 10 lives for no reason, that the only logical choice is to abandon the plane and hope the parachutes work. And Bragg knows that if he hears that order, he might start to believe it. So he cuts the radio, and for the next hour, All-American 3 becomes a ghost. An aircraft that is flying, that is damaged beyond any reasonable hope of survival, that is heading toward Allied lines with no communication, no clearance, no plan except to stay in the air as long as the tail stays on. And the strangest part? It works. For 55 minutes, the aircraft holds together. They cross out of German airspace. They make it over the Netherlands. And by some miracle, German fighters that should have torn them apart either do not see them, do not care, or decide that an aircraft that damaged is not worth the ammunition. But now comes the hardest part, the landing. Because even if you make it back to friendly territory, even if the tail stays attached for 90 minutes, you still have to put this broken machine on the ground without ripping it apart on touchdown. And that is where the real story begins. The problem with flying a half-destroyed bomber is not just that it might fall apart, it is that you do not know when. You do not know which gust of wind, which change in airspeed, which slight adjustment to the controls will be the thing that finally breaks it. And that uncertainty is worse than the damage itself. Because Second Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg is now piloting an aircraft that the United States Army Air Forces has spent the last 55 years pretending never existed. And there is a reason for that. The incident was finally declassified in 1998 when those photographs were released, and aviation historians got their first look at the damage. The reaction was not celebration. It was confusion. Then, suspicion, because the math did not work. Boeing engineers who designed the B-17 looked at the images and said, publicly, on the record, that the aircraft should have experienced immediate structural failure. The fuselage was compromised by more than 40%. 4 out of 6 elevator control cables were severed. The hydraulic lines were completely destroyed. And the tail section, the entire empennage, was being held on by 2 main structural spars that were never designed to carry that load alone. Under normal flight conditions, with the full structural integrity of the fuselage intact, those spars are part of a system. They share the load with stringers, with skin panels, with bulkheads and frames that distribute stress across the entire airframe. But after the collision, all of that is gone. The spars are carrying everything by themselves. And according to every calculation, every stress analysis, every wind tunnel test conducted in the 1950s when the military finally started studying this incident in secret, those spars should have failed within 45 seconds of the collision. Not 90 minutes, 45 seconds. So how did All-American 3 stay in the air? That is the question the Air Force did not want to answer. Because the answer reveals something they were not ready to admit in 1943, and frankly, something they were still not ready to admit in 1998 when they declassified the photos, but not the full engineering report. The answer is that the B-17 had a design flaw, not a catastrophic flaw, not something that made the aircraft unsafe under normal conditions, but a weakness in the tail section attachment points that, under specific types of battle damage, could lead to exactly the kind of structural compromise that happened to all American III. And if the American public knew that in 1943, if the families of B-17 crews knew that their sons and husbands were flying aircraft with a tail section that could be torn halfway off and still somehow remain attached, it would have raised questions. Questions about how many other bombers were lost, not because of enemy fire, but because of structural failure that could have been prevented with better design. Questions about whether the rush to mass-produce bombers meant cutting corners on redundancy and safety. Questions that, in the middle of a war, the military could not afford to answer. So they buried it. They classified the photographs. They classified the debriefing transcripts. They classified the engineering analysis. And they told the crew of All American III to sign non-disclosure agreements and never speak publicly about what happened on February 1st, 1943. And for 52 years, they did not. Not to journalists. Not to historians. Not even in some cases to their own families. Because they had been told, in no uncertain terms, that this incident was a matter of national security. But here is where it gets stranger. The non-disclosure agreements that the crew signed were not standard. They were not the usual wartime secrecy paperwork that said, do not talk about troop movements, do not talk about bombing targets, do not talk about classified equipment. These agreements specifically prohibited the crew from discussing the flight characteristics of the damaged aircraft, not the mission, not the target, not the enemy response. The flight characteristics. Why? What about the way that aircraft flew, half destroyed and barely holding together, was so sensitive that it had to remain classified for 5 decades? The official explanation, when researchers finally started asking questions in the 2000s, was that the military wanted to study the incident for damage control training purposes and did not want the information available to potential adversaries. But that explanation does not hold up, because by the 1950s, the B-17 was obsolete. By the 1960s, it was a museum piece. By the 1970s, every aspect of its design had been declassified and published in aviation journals. Why keep this one incident locked away until 1998? The answer, according to declassified documents that researchers have pieced together over the last 2 decades, is that the crew of All American III discovered something that the Air Force did not want anyone to know. Something that changed the way the military thought about battle damage, about structural failure, about what is possible when an aircraft is pushed beyond every limit it was designed to handle. And that discovery happened in the first 10 minutes after the collision, when Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel, the co-pilot, looked back through the open bomb bay at the torn fuselage and said something that should have been obvious but was not. He said, "The damage is flying us." What Engel meant by that, what he saw when he looked back at the wreckage that was supposed to be the tail of their aircraft, was something that should not have made sense. The 16-foot gash running through the fuselage was not just a hole. It was not just structural damage. It was creating airflow. Wind was rushing through the cabin at 200 miles per hour, screaming through the tier, wrapping around the exposed stringers and frames, and generating a vortex that, against all logic, was actually stabilizing the yaw. The torn metal was acting like a control surface. An accidental rudder, a airfoil that nobody designed, nobody intended, but that was somehow keeping the aircraft from spinning out of control. Now, if you are thinking that sounds like luck, you are half right. But here is what makes it more than luck. Engel recognized it. He did not just see wreckage. He saw aerodynamics. And the moment he understood what was happening, he started doing something that no training manual, no emergency procedure, no standard operating protocol would ever tell a co-pilot to do. He started calculating how to use the damage, not work around it, not compensate for it. Use it. He told Bragg to hold the airspeed at exactly 135 miles per hour, not 140, not 130, 135. Because at 140, the airflow through the tier created too much turbulence, and the tail started to oscillate. At 130, the lift started to fall off, and the nose wanted to drop. But at 135, the vortex stabilized, the tail stayed steady, and the aircraft flew like it was on rails. Uncomfortable rails. Vibrating, shuddering, barely holding together rails. But rails. Then he told the crew to move forward. not just the gunners. Everyone who was not actively flying the aircraft. 3 men crawled from the waist section up toward the cockpit, shifting the center of gravity forward by an estimated 4 feet. 4 feet does not sound like much. But in an aircraft that is already aerodynamically compromised, 4 feet is the difference between controlled flight and an unrecoverable stall. And here is the part that the Air Force really did not want anyone to know. Moving the center of gravity forward like that, in a B-17, is explicitly prohibited in the flight manual. It says, in bold letters, do not operate this aircraft outside of the approved CG envelope. Because if you shift the weight too far forward, the elevator loses authority, the nose drops, and you cannot pull out. But Engel did the math in his head. He knew that with the tail section barely attached, with half the control cables gone, the normal CG limits did not apply anymore. The aircraft was not normal, so the rules for flying it could not be normal either. And he was right. The forward CG, combined with the vortex from the torn fuselage, created a stable configuration that should not have existed but did. And for the next hour, All-American 3 flew in a state that Boeing engineers would later describe as emergent aerodynamics. A term that means, essentially, we do not know why it worked, but it worked. But emergence only happens when the conditions are exactly right. Change one variable, one input, one parameter, and the whole thing collapses. So, Bragg and Engel are now flying an aircraft that will only stay in the air if they do everything perfectly. Not well, perfectly. No sudden movements. No course corrections. No evasive maneuvers if German fighters show up. Straight, level, steady flight at 135 miles per hour, 12,000 feet above occupied Europe, praying that the weather holds, the structure holds, and nobody on the ground decides to shoot at the crippled bomber limping across the sky. And that is when the German fighters appear. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s, climbing fast from below, black crosses visible on their wings even from a distance. In a normal engagement, a B-17 would rely on its gunners, on formation support, on the ability to maneuver and evade. All-American 3 has none of that. The waist gunners have already moved forward. The tail gunner is still back there, but his position is so unstable he cannot fire without risking the structure. And maneuvering? Out of the question. One hard bank and the tail comes off. So Bragg does the only thing he can do. He holds course. He holds altitude. He watches the fighters close the distance, 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000, and he waits for the cannon fire that will end this. But it does not come. The Focke-Wulfs pull alongside, close enough that the German pilots can see the damage, can see the torn fuselage, can see that this aircraft is already dead and just does not know it yet. And then they peel off. They do not fire. They do not engage. They just leave. Now, there are 3 theories about why. Theory 1 is that they thought the aircraft was too damaged to waste ammunition on, that it would crash on its own. Theory 2 is that there was an unspoken rule among some fighter pilots, rare but documented, about not finishing off crippled aircraft, a kind of respect for an enemy that was already beaten. Theory 3, and this is the one that makes people uncomfortable, is that the German pilots reported what they saw, and German intelligence wanted to know how the Americans were flying an aircraft in that condition, so they let it go to see where it would land. We will never know which theory is correct. The Luftwaffe records from that day were lost. The German pilots were never identified, but what we do know is that for reasons nobody can fully explain, All-American 3 was allowed to keep flying. And now the crew has a new problem. They are approaching Allied airspace, which means they need to land. And landing a half-destroyed bomber is not like landing a normal one. It is like landing a bomb that might explode the moment it touches the ground. 58 minutes into the flight, the radio finally breaks silence. Not because Bragg wants to, because they have no choice. They need a runway, and not just any runway. They need one that is long, straight, and surrounded by nothing that will kill them when this goes wrong. Because everyone in that cockpit knows what is about to happen. The landing gear might collapse. The tail might fold on touchdown. The aircraft might veer off the runway and cartwheel into a fireball. But staying in the air is no longer an option. Fuel is dropping. The structure is deteriorating. Every minute they stay airborne is another minute closer to catastrophic failure at altitude. And if the tail comes off at 12,000 feet, there is no surviving that. So the radio operator sends the message. Short. Clipped. Matter of fact, request immediate straight-in approach. Any available field. Belgium or Netherlands. No turns possible. Repeat. No turns. There is a pause on the other end. A long one, because what the controller is hearing does not make sense. A bomber requesting a straight-in approach with no ability to maneuver is a bomber that should not still be flying. But the controller does not ask questions. He just vectors them toward a Royal Air Force forward airfield in Belgium, a place called Leeuwarden. Runway heading 090. Almost perfectly aligned with their current course. Almost. They are going to have to turn just 5 degrees. 5 degrees does not sound like much. But when you are flying an aircraft that can only survive in a perfectly narrow band of conditions, 5 degrees might as well be 50. Bragg looks at Engel. Engel looks at the torn fuselage behind them, and they both know that this is the moment. Either the aircraft can handle a gentle turn, or it cannot. And if it cannot, they are going to have to find a field, any field, and put it down in whatever direction they happen to be pointing. Bragg takes a breath. He applies the slightest pressure to the yoke, a whisper of input, barely enough to register. The nose starts to drift right. The aircraft begins to bank, 1 degree, 2 degrees, and then the whole structure shudders. Not a vibration, a shudder, like something deep inside the airframe just shifted and is trying to decide whether to hold or let go. The yaw wants to amplify. The tail starts to swing out of alignment. And for 3 seconds, everyone holds their breath, because this is it. This is where the tail tears off, and they spiral into the ground with no time to react, no time to bail out, just a long fall, and then nothing. But Engel is already moving. He reaches over and pulls the throttle back on the number 3 engine. Just a fraction. Enough to reduce asymmetric thrust. Enough to let the tail settle back into alignment. And the shudder stops. The aircraft straightens. They are now on heading 090, pointed directly at the runway. But the turn cost them. Airspeed dropped to 128 miles per hour. The nose is trying to sink. Bragg has to add power, gently, carefully, because too much throttle will create stress on the spars, and the spars are barely holding as it is. He brings the speed back up to 135. The nose lifts. And now, they are in the approach corridor. 5 miles out, the runway is visible through the windscreen, a thin gray line in the middle of flat Belgian farmland, and on the ground, the emergency crews are already moving into position, because the word has gone out. Crippled bomber inbound. Catastrophic damage. Expect crash landing. Fire trucks line both sides of the runway. Ambulances are staged at the far end. Medical teams are standing by with stretchers. And every person on that airfield is watching the sky, waiting for the B-17 to appear, expecting to see it come apart in midair, expecting to see parachutes, expecting to see an impact and an explosion. What they are not expecting is what actually happens. The bomber appears on the horizon, low, slow, but stable. It is not trailing smoke. It is not in a spin. It is flying. And then someone on the ground sees the tail section through binoculars, sees the gash, sees the missing structure, sees that the entire back end of the aircraft is held together by almost nothing. And the reaction is not relief. It is disbelief. Someone says, out loud, "How is that still attached?" Nobody has an answer, because at this point, All-American 3 has been in the air for 1 hour and 27 minutes since the collision. It has flown 90 miles over enemy territory. It has survived German fighters. It has executed a turn that should have ripped it apart. And now it is 3 miles from touchdown. 3 miles from either the most miraculous landing in military aviation history or the most spectacular crash. And the crew inside has no idea which one it is going to be. Bragg lines up the center line. Engel calls out altitude, 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet, 500 feet. The ground is rising. The runway is coming. And every man in that cockpit knows that the next 60 seconds will decide whether they walk away or whether they do not. Bragg eases the throttles back. The nose drops slightly. The aircraft sinks toward the runway. 300 feet, 200 feet, 100 feet. And then the wheels kiss the concrete. The first thing that happens is nothing. For a half second, maybe less, the aircraft just rolls. Wheels on pavement. Weight transferring. Normal. Then the right main gear collapses. Not brakes. Collapses. The strut just folds inward like it was never locked, and the entire right wing drops, the tips scraping concrete, throwing sparks, and the aircraft immediately starts to slew right. Bragg fights it. Left rudder. Left brake, trying to keep the nose pointed down the runway. but the asymmetric drag is pulling them toward the grass, toward the ditch, toward the fire trucks that are now scrambling to get out of the way. And then the tail section does something that nobody predicted. It twists. Not tears off. Twists. The whole empennage rotates 5 degrees counterclockwise, like a bottle cap being unscrewed, and the torque ripples forward through the fuselage, through the frames, through the structure, and the aircraft lurches left. Hard left. Overcorrecting. They are sliding, not rolling. 30 degrees off centerline. 40 degrees. The left wing dips. The propellers on the number 1 and 2 engines are 6 inches from the runway, and everyone watching from the ground is thinking the same thing. This is where it cartwheels. This is where the wing catches, the nose flips, the aircraft tumbles, and the fuel ignites. But it does not catch. Because Bragg does something that goes against every instinct, every reflex, every piece of training he has ever received. He does not try to correct. He lets it slide. He keeps the wings level, keeps the throttles at idle, and just lets the aircraft weather vane into the skid, bleeding speed, bleeding energy, until the friction and the drag and the sheer mass of 12 tons of aluminum finally win. The aircraft shudders one last time. The tail drops. The nose settles. And 800 feet down the runway, 32 degrees off centerline, with the right gear collapsed, the tail twisted, and the fuselage torn open like a gutted fish, All-American 3 stops moving. There is no explosion, no fire, no secondary collapse, just silence. And inside the cockpit, Bragg and Engel sit perfectly still, hands still on the controls, eyes still forward, like they are waiting for one more thing to go wrong. But nothing does. The aircraft is done. It gave them everything it had, and now it is finished. Engel is the first one to move. He reaches up, shuts down the engines, and says, very quietly, "We are on the ground." Bragg does not respond. He just nods, because his hands are shaking too hard to speak. Outside, the fire crews are rushing in, foam cannons ready, expecting fuel leaks, expecting hot metal, expecting the kind of post-crash scenario they train for. What they find instead is 10 men climbing out of the hatches, one by one, slowly, carefully, like they are not entirely sure the ground is real. The tail gunner is the last one out. He drops from the rear hatch, looks back at the twisted wreckage of his position, and just stands there for a moment, staring. Because he spent an hour and a half sitting in a compartment that was barely attached to the rest of the aircraft, watching the sky through gaps in the torn metal, knowing that at any second the whole thing could rip away and take him with it. And he is still alive. They are all still alive. A British officer approaches Bragg, looks at the aircraft, looks at the crew, and asks the only question that makes sense. How? Bragg does not have an answer. Not one that fits into words. So he just says, "I do not know." But that is not entirely true, because over the next 3 hours, as the crew is debriefed, as engineers swarm the wreckage, as photographers document every inch of the damage, a picture starts to form. Not of luck, not of skill alone, but of something else. A combination of observation, adaptation, and a willingness to throw out the rulebook when the rulebook no longer applies. Engel figured out that the damage was creating lift. The crew redistributed weight in a way that was technically forbidden. Bragg flew the aircraft at a speed that was outside normal operating limits. And together, those decisions created a configuration that allowed a half-destroyed bomber to stay airborne long enough to make it home. But here is what nobody talks about in the official reports. Here is what gets buried in the classified files and the redacted debriefs. They did not just survive. They discovered something. A principle that would later become foundational in damage control training, in emergency flight procedures, in the way modern pilots are taught to handle catastrophic failures. Fly what you have, not what you wish you had. Not what the manual says you should have. What you actually have in front of you, right now, in this moment. Because All-American 3 was unflyable by every standard definition. But it was flyable by one definition, the only one that mattered. It was still in the air. And as long as it was in the air, there was a chance. Now, if you are wondering what happened next, if you want to know why this incident stayed classified for 55 years, why the crew was silenced, why the engineering reports were buried, and what the Air Force was really trying to hide, you are going to want to stick around for the next part of this story, because the landing was just the beginning. What happened in the weeks and months after, the investigation that was conducted in secret, the design changes that were made without public acknowledgement, And the testimony that was sealed until some of the crew members were already dead, that is where this story gets really interesting. So if you are not subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button now, because we are going deep on this one, and you are not going to want to miss what comes next. Alright, let us talk about what happened after the wheels stopped rolling. Within 6 hours of the landing, 3 things happened that tell you this is not going to be treated like a normal incident. First, the aircraft is surrounded by armed guards. Not fire crews, not maintenance personnel, armed guards. Military police with orders to keep everyone except authorized personnel at least 50 feet away from the wreckage. Second, every single photograph taken by the ground crews, every image captured by the official Air Force photographers, every shot of the damage, the torn fuselage, the twisted tail section, all of it gets stamped classified before the film is even developed. And third, the crew is separated. Not debriefed together, separated. Each man is taken to a different room, interviewed individually, and told in very clear terms that what happened on February 1st is now a matter of operational security. They are not to discuss the flight with each other. They are not to discuss it with other crews. They are not to write about it in letters home. And they are absolutely not to speak with any journalists or historians or anyone outside the military chain of command. When one of the waist gunners asks why, the intelligence officer conducting the interview says something that stays with him for the rest of his life. Because we need to understand what happened before anyone else does. That phrase, before anyone else does, implies 2 things. 1, that what happened was significant enough to warrant immediate analysis. And 2, that someone else, someone outside the American military, might want to know about it. Which raises the question, who? The Germans already saw the aircraft in the air. If they wanted intelligence on how a B-17 could survive that kind of damage, they had their chance. So, who was the Air Force worried about? The answer, according to documents that would not be declassified until the early 2000s, is not external. It is internal. The Air Force is worried about their own bomber crews. Because if word gets out that a B-17 can lose 40% of its structural integrity and still make it home, it changes the calculus. It changes how crews think about battle damage. It changes the decision-making process when an aircraft gets hit. Right now, in February 1943, the standard procedure for catastrophic structural damage is clear. Bail out. Do not try to save the aircraft. Do not risk the crew. Just get out and hope the parachutes work. But All-American 3 just proved that in at least one case, that procedure would have been wrong. If Bragg had ordered his crew to bail out, if he had followed protocol, all 10 men would have jumped from a perfectly flyable aircraft and landed in occupied territory where they would have been captured or killed. Instead, they stayed with the aircraft, made it back to Allied lines, and walked away. So now the Air Force has a problem. Do they tell other bomber crews about this? Do they revise the emergency procedures to account for the possibility that severe structural damage might still be survivable? Or do they bury it, keep the existing protocols in place, and avoid the chaos of every pilot second-guessing whether they should bail out or try to fly their crippled bomber home? They choose to bury it. Not completely. The incident is documented. It is studied. Boeing engineers are brought in to examine the wreckage and figure out why the tail did not separate. Metallurgists analyze the spars to see if there was some anomaly in the material that gave them extra strength. Aerodynamicists try to recreate the flight conditions to understand how the vortex from the torn fuselage could have stabilized the aircraft. But all of that happens behind closed doors. No press releases. No commendations for the crew that mention the specifics of what they survived. No training bulletins distributed to other squadrons. Just silence. A set of non-disclosure agreements that each crew member is required to sign before they are allowed to return to duty. The agreements are 3 pages long. Most of it is standard wartime secrecy language. But buried in the second page is a clause that is anything but standard. It says, and this is a direct quote from one of the surviving copies, the undersigned agrees not to disclose any information regarding the flight characteristics, structural behavior, or operational limitations of aircraft designation 4-2-31063, observed during the incident of February 1, 1943. Flight characteristics, structural behavior, operational limitations. Those are not intelligence terms. Those are engineering terms, which means the Air Force is not worried about the Germans finding out what happened. They are worried about their own people understanding what it means. Because if you start telling bomber crews that structural damage can be flown through, that the manual is not always right, that sometimes the best decision is to ignore protocol and trust your instincts, you open a door that the military does not want opened. You create a culture where pilots start making judgment calls instead of following orders. And in the middle of a war, where coordination and predictability are everything, that kind of independent thinking is dangerous. Not to the enemy, to the command structure. So the incident gets locked away. The crew gets reassigned to different units within a month. The wreckage of All-American 3 gets studied, stripped for parts, and then quietly scrapped. No museum preservation, no historical marker, no public acknowledgement that anything unusual even happened. And for the next 55 years, the only people who know the full story are the 10 men who lived it, the engineers who studied it, and a handful of senior officers who decided it was safer to keep it classified than to let it become public knowledge. But here is the thing about secrets. They do not stay buried forever. But let us step back from the conspiracy theories for a moment and look at what we actually know. Not speculation, not rumor. What the declassified evidence, the engineering studies that have been published, and the first-hand accounts that did eventually surface tell us about what made this survival possible. Because the real story, the one that does not require secret transcripts or hidden agendas, is remarkable enough on its own. When Boeing engineers finally got access to the wreckage in late 1943, after it had been stripped and studied and photographed from every angle, they wrote an internal report that would not be made public until 2010. And that report contains a paragraph that changes the entire framing of the incident. It says, "The survival of aircraft 42-31063 was not attributable to any single factor, but rather to a confluence of conditions that are unlikely to be replicated. The structural failure occurred along a seam that, while compromised, retained sufficient load-bearing capacity due to rivet placement that exceeded standard specifications by approximately 12%. This over-engineering, likely the result of individual manufacturing variance, provided a margin of integrity that would not be present in an aircraft built precisely to blueprint specifications." Read that again. The aircraft survived because it was built slightly wrong, not defectively, just differently. Some worker at the Boeing plant in Seattle, putting rivets into the tail section in 1942, placed them a little closer together than the blueprint specified. Maybe they misread the spacing. Maybe they were being extra cautious. Maybe it was just a random variation that happens in mass production. But that 12% difference in rivet density meant that when the collision happened, when the fuselage tore open and the tail section should have separated immediately, there was just enough extra structural integrity to keep it attached. Not strong enough to be safe, but strong enough to be survivable. For 90 minutes. Now, here is what makes that paragraph so significant. It means that if the incident had happened to any other B-17, built to exact specifications, the tail would have come off, the crew would have died, and there would be no story. It was not skill. It was not luck in the cosmic sense. It was manufacturing tolerance. A variation so small that it would never be noticed under normal circumstances, but under the exact set of conditions that occurred on February 1st, 1943, it was the difference between life and death. And that terrified the Air Force. Because if survival came down to whether your aircraft happened to have rivets spaced at 12% above standard, then every other B-17 crew flying missions over Europe was operating on a margin that was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. It meant that the aircraft they were advertising as rugged, as battle-tested, as capable of taking massive damage and bringing crews home, was actually only as strong as the specific tolerances of the individual airframe. Some B-17s could survive a tail strike, most could not, and there was no way to know which one you were flying until it was too late. So, the Air Force made a decision. They reinforced the tail section attachment points on all subsequent B-17 production models. Quietly. No press release. No acknowledgement that there was ever a problem. They just updated the manufacturing specs, increased the rivet density across the board, and moved on. And it worked. Post-1943, there are no recorded incidents of a B-17 losing its tail section in a mid-air collision and surviving. Not because crews stopped surviving. Because the collisions that did happen resulted in immediate structural failure the way they were supposed to, the way All-American 3 should have. Which means that in a strange, indirect way, the crew of All-American 3 saved lives. Not through heroism, not through their flying skill, but by being the data point that revealed a flaw. By surviving something they should not have survived, they proved that the aircraft had a vulnerability. And that vulnerability got fixed. But nobody could say that out loud, because saying it out loud means admitting that the vulnerability existed in the first place. It means admitting that crews were flying aircraft with a structural weakness that the manufacturer either did not know about or did not consider significant enough to address. And in the middle of a war, when morale and public confidence are everything, that is not a message you can afford to send. So the incident gets classified. The crew gets silenced. The engineering fix gets implemented without explanation. And for 55 years, the official position is that nothing unusual happened on February 1st, 1943. Just another damaged bomber that made it home. Happens all the time. Except it did not happen all the time. It happened once. To one crew, in one aircraft, under one specific set of circumstances that included a manufacturing variance, a co-pilot with an engineering background who recognized emergent aerodynamics, a pilot who was willing to fly outside the manual, and a series of decisions that went against every piece of standard training but turned out to be exactly right. And that combination, that exact alignment of factors, is what makes this story so compelling. Because it is not about heroes. It is not about luck. It is about the narrow space between disaster and survival, and how sometimes that space is only as wide as 12% extra rivet density. Now, if you have made it this far, if you are still watching, I am going to ask you to do something. Leave a comment and tell me what you think really happened in those missing 12 minutes of radio silence. Do you think the crew discovered something they were not supposed to see? Do you think the transcripts reveal a design flaw the Air Force is still protecting? Or do you think the simplest explanation is the right one, that they just got lucky and the military overclassified everything out of an abundance of caution? I want to know what you think, because this channel is not just me talking at you. It is a conversation, and some of the best insights come from the comments. And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We have got more stories like this, incidents that were buried, forgotten, or classified, and we are bringing them back into the light. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let us keep digging into the history they did not want you to know. All right, one more thing before we wrap this up.